Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the special meeting of the school board on Thursday, September 24th at 5:36. Will you call the roll?
Mrs. Barker? Here. Mr. Bryant?
Here.
Mrs. Fairgrave?
Here.
Mrs. McCabe?
Here.
Mr. McNally? Ms. Weigel?
Here.
Mr. Manheim?
Here. Thank you. And Mr. Bryant is calling in with us this evening. So, will you please rise for the pledge? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We got a lot of good stuff to talk about tonight. Are there any citizens' comments? Oh, all right, thank you. All right, so this takes us to, we do have two action items tonight. Those are carryovers from our board meeting on Monday, or L&T, I'm sorry. Everything seems to run together. So from our L&T. So do I have a motion to approve the Meeting Owl Pro video conferencing campus?
So moved. Second.
All right, thank you. Mr. McNally has joined us at 5:38. Welcome, Mr. McNally. Any discussion on the Owl Pro video conferencing campus?
Were we going to see a demo?
It was in here before the meeting, showing the whole room. There is one here. So it was set up, but they've moved it out of the center, so it's not captured. You want to see it again? You can have them set it back up.
No, I didn't realize we had to come prior to the meeting. Okay.
No problem.
Actually, do you mind? Can we look at it?
Sure.
Does it take just about a second or?
Mr. Smith just stepped out. We'll get him to get it.
Okay. While he is doing that, I do just have an added comment to it. In a call with some of our colleagues, I asked about how they're using technology at some of the other districts, and I'm sure you know this. So in a pinch, they're setting up 2 Chromebooks for teachers, so that might be an option until the owls come. So they have like a dueling Chromebook situation, one to use and one to kind of show. As well as they're utilizing an iPad scenario and Chromebook kind of together, an iPad headset that would have the at-home students and then Chromebook. So that was in Elmhurst 205. The 2 dueling Chromebooks was $220. So if we needed to in a pinch, and I'm sure you're aware of that, I mean, those are just a couple ideas that I thought were interesting. Could be an alternative opportunity for us to still engage all of our different student units until the owl is fully functional.
Would we have the Chromebooks and or iPads to do that, or because it sounds to me like that technology, that all the technology is kind of at a premium right now?
The question will be whether or not we have additional Chromebooks that come in. We have some on order and are expecting to receive some. Or we don't have enough right now to give every teacher an extra Chromebook.
I have a question, Dr. Pearson. Will these devices be used once we are not in a pandemic? Do you see what can happen with our instruction using this device in the future?
Yes, I certainly think that it has application for our blended learning classes, which we have already started offering at high school. So it certainly could be used for those purposes. I'm sure that as teachers use them for video conferencing, they're going to find ways that they might want to use it again in the future. I just also want to remind everybody, this technology changes so quickly that 2 to 3 years from now, there will be a new device. So yes, but I do think we could use them.
And Dr. Pearson, could you just remind us in regards to the cost of it and kind of where our budget is? And I know we're going to see more of this on Monday, but is it a stretch for our budget? Is it not a stretch for our budget? And just, reassure the board kind of where we're at.
Sure, so we certainly have the funds in the budget to make these purchases. We're shifting things around as necessary. And so I think right now in the IT budget, we have the money that we need to purchase these devices. I also want to just remind everyone that we are expecting to be reimbursed for some expenses related to COVID-19. The first batch of CARES Act funding, which was about $500,000, that was, you could use that for technology. I think that that's will continue to be our priority. So as we anticipate additional funding to become available, it will help offset some of the cost of some of the additional technology and infrastructure that we needed, in addition to the PPE reimbursement, which we expect from FEMA and IEMA.
Okay, thank you so much. So what I'm looking at is just.
The camera is the white.
Is that, okay, so Mr. Smith is walking back and forth and it's following his pattern.
He's going to talk about
I'm unable to bring it up on the screen right now just because of the stream and everything. We had it going beforehand, but typically we would have this display on a projector, and we're going to get skewed a little bit by the PA system. But if you were speaking, the camera would view on you and focus in. If you see now it might be doing 1 or 2 or 3 windows, it'll change based on what it hears and what it sees. So if some of you were to be talking right now, the windows would change, the software would have it adjust based on what is going on in the room.
So there doesn't have to be anything on the specific individual for it to key on that person.
Correct. Then the microphones and the cameras inside the system are using software to key on where that's coming from, and it adjusts accordingly.
So if I say something, it should turn and look.
It should add you in about 4 to 5 seconds. If you kind of have to keep going.
I need to keep talking so it will hear me and register. I don't see it moving yet.
Why don't you try turning off your microphone and talking?
And just talk like this?
You're down there. You're in the corner.
Oh,
Just
you
keep
can
going.
see it,
Maybe you're
okay.
not far enough.
Okay.
We found that it works well up to 20, even 25 feet away. You have to be a little bit louder at that point, but within 18 feet is really good.
And so will there be a specific spot in each classroom that these are supposed to be at, or will the teacher have the ability to go based on what they need in their style?
Yeah, our plan is to show teachers where we think it would go ideally, but they certainly have the flexibility to move it where they see fit.
And how much training do you think will be required for the teachers?
Minimal.
Okay.
We've had this with teachers and with our instructional technology team, given no instructions just to see what would happen, and they were up and running in seconds.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think it would work with all the microphones and everything we have going on right now, but if I were to call in to the meet that I have going here, the audio coming out of it is really high quality, akin to an Apple home speaker or a Sonos system. So it's really nice. You hear the remote students much better than with any other device that I could think of now.
Can the OWL just are you able to hook up with Bluetooth speakers if you're the teacher to have maybe a speaker, one end, and you can hear what's going on with your online kids, or does it not?
You would hear your online kids through the speaker.
Through that, but not through, you couldn't hook it to something that you have.
I don't believe that would work.
Were you able to find out how quickly we can get?
I don't have any more clarification on that other than November. We check with them every time we talk, but it hasn't changed.
Have we been in contact with any other schools that are using this device?
We have not. I don't know how many there are. There's many universities that are making use of them that I've seen, but I haven't seen it at the K-12 level yet.
Mr. Bryant, the Regional Office of Education actually has one and uses it for meetings, for people that are in person and virtually attending meetings. I've been at several meetings. Actually, I've been at a meeting at the ROE where it was used, and I called into a meeting at the ROE where it was used. So I know, we know some people that have used one.
The reason for my question is, I'm curious to see how it would work in a classroom. And the reason being is I saw that the room size recommendation is 15 by 20, and the radius is 18 feet. So obviously the number one priority is have the teacher be heard on this, but can this device be supported in the size of our classrooms? And
we tested the device in classrooms at East, several different ones in several different sizes, and found it to work well in seeing and hearing students throughout the classroom.
And then also, will this, I guess another concern I have is how will this function with Zoom or Google Meet on the students' Chromebooks? I mean, we're asking students to turn video up right now so the Chromebooks function better. Are the Chromebooks adequate to support the video that's coming through these devices as well as Zoom or anywhere else?
Yes, you would actually have the window of the owl within your Zoom meeting. We ask students when they're having processing issues to turn off their own camera, but they still should have the camera view of the class and or the teacher on their screen. So this wouldn't be any different from a remote student point of view, other than being able to see more of the room and to hear better.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, will we call roll?
Mr. Bryant?
No.
Mrs. Fairgrave?
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Ms. Weigel?
Yes.
Mrs. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Manheim?
Yes, motion passes. All right, do I have a motion to approve whiteboard solution?
So moved. Second.
Bible, thank you. Any discussion pertaining to the whiteboard solution?
Just for clarification on this particular item, they are still trying to select a final device. Mr. Smith has one today that's a tablet that does the whiteboard for the teacher to display on the screen as well as on the in the remote classroom. But we're confident that this device will be around $500 per classroom, and we're just asking for not to exceed approval so we can purchase these as well.
I just had a general comment that I wanted to make. Dr. Pearson and I spoke about this on Tuesday as well. Certainly, I continue to be very supportive of reopening the schools, the high schools as a personal impact for me as well. But I'm really looking forward to continuing improvement in our high school model or structure. What we're moving into in October, we're actually going to have a reduction in instruction hours compared to what we have today. So I'm very hopeful that when we talk again in November or early December timeframe, that there will be some additional recommendations on how we can improve upon what we have. Especially because going into our first reopening, we are going to have lunches for some students. So I think it's a challenging problem that I would like to see us be able to solve going into the second semester. I want it all for our students. I want them to have the best education that they can get, at the same time balancing the social emotional piece. So just wanted to comment on that and set the table for going forward from my view.
I appreciate that, Mrs. Fairgrave. I actually sent notes to Dr. Pearson and Mr. Manheim to a webinar I went to that talked about how do you handle leadership in COVID today, put on by a different legal firm. And one of the things that the superintendent that was speaking talked about was that we've had to unlearn the model of what we know goes, and we have to learn school month by month now. And so I think to that point, that's kind of where the pandemic has brought us, which is we have to review everything as we go and look at what we need to fix or improve or change. Because unfortunately, the model that was tried and true is no longer. And so I certainly echo those words. And I know Dr. Pearson And the team has looked at things and had to reevaluate and change them as we go. And, you know, I certainly would encourage this board and community to try to look at it that way. Moving forward, education is much different than we've known, so. It was really eye-opening for me to kind of hear that, so.
Again, on Ms. Fairgreaves' comments, I agree that we want to make sure that we're not losing instruction. My hope is, and I can tell you from my perspective as a teacher, the instruction will be better if it's in person. So I'd rather have more of that quality instruction. I'll just give you an example, different district, obviously, but today I was remote teaching, and I ended up, because of all the malfunctions with the technology, and that's going to happen no matter what, I ended up teaching about a class and a half off my iPhone. They didn't get quality instruction from me today, and I think I'm a pretty good teacher, but they got lousy instruction, and it would have been great instruction had I been in person. Had they had just half the time that I spent today in person, would have been better time. So I agree, and if we can, once we get into this model, if we can find ways to tweak it and make it better as we go. But as I think I've said 1,000 times, there are no experts yet. So I'm hoping that that all works out. I do want to see increased, I do agree, I would like to see increased time with the students. But for now, I think the time actually with the students is pretty important.
Completely agree with all those points. Again, I'm just making a comment that what I'm looking forward to is that we're continuously improving versus setting that this is the format until next May. So that's all my comment.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
All right, any questions or comments for Mr. Smith on the whiteboard solutions? All right, we take the roll.
Mrs. Fairgrave,
Yes.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Ms. Weigel,
Yes.
Mrs. Barker,
Yes.
Mr. Bryant,
Yes.
Mr. Mannheim.
Yes, motion passes. All right, that concludes our items for action. So we'll move to our items for discussion, and first we'll lead off with our facilities master plan. Before I turn it over to Mr. Critta and his team, kind of to set the tone for us as a board tonight, this is kind of the next step in our facility master plan. So I think it's important that we give bold information and kind of direction on what we're looking for as a board, where we want to go in our next steps, how we want to task CAC with things, and doing community reach. So I think it's important that we kind of give them some direction after tonight so that they can continue the work that they're doing to stay on task and schedule to present to us in the spring, the final report. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody tonight. Thanks for inviting us in. I'm going to hand out the full booklet of the educational alignment evaluation just so everyone has a clearer vision they might see on the screen tonight. They're heavy. Like a copy. Oh, thank you. I've also got a schedule, just a little clear picture of what you'll see on the screen. You're welcome. All right, thank you for being with us there for helping distributed. We appreciate the time tonight to talk about what the next steps look like for a long-range planning process. I think one of our focuses is definitely to understand what the board is asking for. What is the outcome that you're desiring through this process? How does it move forward? Also, what is the deliverable? What are you asking the long-range planning committee to actually provide to you through this process? So what we want to do tonight, so I'm in charge of this slide, is talk a little bit about overall planning schedule, and that's the larger sheet you have there, but there's also a version of that on a slide coming up. Talk a little bit about the facility planning process, but also what is that outcome that you're looking for as a board. We'll just touch briefly on the facility condition assessment and give you a quick update on that. And then we'll spend some time on the educational alignment or capacity overview. That's the booklet that you have in front of you. And that is a final version of that. I know there's one piece of this that enrollment data is still kind of being vetted at the district level. That may or may not have a minimal impact to some of the information that's in the packet, but we can certainly update that if there's more information that filters in on that, what your projections will look like. And then just talk about next steps. How do we move forward and what does that look like? So get into the original schedule, and we've modified this a little bit just to keep it current. The first phase of fact finding really took place starting back in January and moved right up through August. So what was developed in that fact finding phase is really two tandem reports. One focused on facility conditions or the physical conditions of the building, and then the second, which is the educational alignment evaluation, which is the packet you have in front of you tonight. So those fact books are really intended to be the resources that a long-range planning committee would rely on to make decisions and go forward. It's the hard data, basically, so they can make sound decisions. The next phase of this then would be the vision process, which we're asking that long-range planning committee, and this model certainly needs to be tailored to whatever makes sense for the district, but it would be the criteria that committee will develop based on what are we going to solve, what needs are we going to prioritize to make sure we're moving forward the best interest of the district. And then the next phase of that is that planning phase, which is kind of a part two of the long-range planning committee's charge, we will develop options with them and come to one best solution. There might be a couple versions of that, but what does the plan look like moving forward that solves the needs that were identified as priorities? So, and we'll get a little bit deeper into this, and certainly feel free to ask questions along the way too. This is somewhat familiar territory, although we haven't talked about it for quite a while, and it has been updated a little bit. So starting in the visions bracket of the schedule, we're sitting here tonight at the board workshop, and that's kind of a launching point to decide how do we involve a long-range planning committee and what does that timeline look like. So we always want the district and the board to have guiding principles as they move forward. So it'll give the long-range planning committee basically some steering. What are they going to be charged with? What is their mission as they talk about the topics that are important to them, but also the facts that we're going to provide to them. And you've got some very robust commitments already at the board level and at the district level that would make a great framework. I mean, I think this is already pretty much ready to go. So as a long-range planning committee understands what their charge is, this is always in the background, knowing that we need to stay on track. The things they're talking about shouldn't stray from some of your high-level priorities that you've got in these commitments. This would be something that you may build into your charge statement, or maybe it's common knowledge for the CAC and the folks that will be involved with the long-range planning. So we took just kind of a draft version. This is certainly a starting point for the board, is to talk about what is the charge of that facility planning committee, and then what is the outcome. And other things that you might want to infill between those two items are going to be important for the facility planning committee to understand context. What are they supposed to get out of this process? What do you want them to do? And what we've done is we've diagrammed what seems to work pretty well. We've talked about 3 focus groups in the past. It's all one long-range planning committee, but the 3 focus groups allow members of that committee to kind of follow a passion. If there's a topic or a focus that they want to be part of, they can lead those interests into that discussion. So breaking them into 3 subgroups makes a lot of sense. It gets a little more intimate dialogue, as well as focused on things that people are interested in, want to talk about. So the really important part of this process is bringing those committees back together and agree on the needs. The needs are basically the criteria. What are we going to solve moving forward? Without agreement at that level, the process, the options really become endless. You can develop options because you're always looking back and saying, we really never agreed on what we should be addressing. So that agree on needs is a really important hurdle in this process. And then it moves into the second phase of that. I'll bump ahead here. So we've identified different types of topics within 3 groups: a learning spaces focus group, a physical conditions focus group, and a community space focus group. They seem to have worked pretty well in the past. Certainly this is room to tailor this discussion if you see some things that you want to change. But learning space has been focused on what's the vision of the district moving forward as far as a student as an agent, student as a learner. You've got blended learning programs and other special programs that are part of that discussion. Building equity may be a big piece of that. The programming, the technology and education. So just having some focus on learning as a whole. The second group being a community space group is how does the community use your buildings, prefer to use your buildings. What are the partnerships and relationships at that level that could be strengthened or could be through facilities? That's really probably the chief topic in that group. And then physical conditions is talking about capacity enrollment and grade configuration as it fits in a building, not from a philosophical level, but as a fit. Because the learning spaces group will also have some discussion on that topic. And then site and efficiency of buildings. And the physical conditions, which will have a good kind of platform of this is the capital improvements as we see moving forward. So there won't be a lot of dialogue or prioritizing at that level. It'll be more information of this is what we're looking at moving forward. So I talked about the meeting schedule. We usually have a kickoff meeting that would provide all that data to this group as a whole. And then the second, third, fourth meeting, we separated those focus groups and really try to identify what the conversations should be within each of those 3 groups. Then the 5th meeting, we get back together, talk as a group and find the common ground and really have each group kind of express, these are the things that we decided were important, how do they align with the other committees' discussions, and push to get an agreement on needs. I will say sometimes a second meeting is required for that process, but in the time frame that we're talking about, 5 meetings seem to fit pretty well between now and the year. And again, subject to the board's interest as well. The second phase of this then would be, from a calendar standpoint, would be after the first of the year, but that would be to talk about what solutions meet those needs, review solutions and options to move forward with, and refining that as a meeting number 8, to refine those and prepare a board recommendation. So in general speaking, this group would be bringing a recommendation to the board for your consideration on a long-range facility plan. Questions so far?
Can you talk a little bit about the role of the board with the focus group, with the Citizens Advisory Committee, and then the role of the board outside of the focus groups, and where the board should stay away and let people do the work?
Yeah, great question. Typically what we've seen is the board really sets the tone for what they want to have achieved out of the long-range planning process. They wouldn't necessarily attending the meetings or be part of that discussion firsthand. We would usually do an update after the first set of meetings to play back, okay, the committee's really landed on these set of needs. Now we're going to move forward and see what kind of plan or solutions will address those. So you have an interim update, at least after that first kind of those vision setting meetings. And at that point, you can redirect, maybe add some more context that might steer that group a little different direction if you feel like there's something that's not quite tracking with the commitments. It's a point to check in. But certainly, now that's a model that we're familiar with, but if the board wants to have more hands-on involvement, that's really up to this group if you feel like that's a necessity. I understand the Citizens Advisory Committee was a great starting point to have this long-range planning group formed, and maybe some supplemental members on it from an education perspective, or filling any kind of missing stakeholders that might be a great voice to have in that group.
So just, excuse me, just to clarify, so that would be like after kind of step 5, I'm trying to just quantify it. We would have kind of a coming together with you and the board and talk about where the agreed upon needs are before the discussion begins?
Correct.
Okay. Can I ask another question, or did you have another one? Where would we have like a conversation philosophically with the board, or where does that come in? Is that tonight? Is that what tonight is?
I think the starting point is tonight. Certainly before we land on a meeting one where we're sharing what the long-range planning committee is being charged with, you would want to have that fully formulated. So this group all feels like it's going in the same direction. So philosophically, I think that, now I know the board commitments create a pretty good outline for that, but if there's other tone you want to set for that long-range planning process, between now and the first meeting, we want to have that charge statement, built in the charge statement.
Okay. I'm gonna hang tight on the rest of my comments till later. Okay.
There is a charge statement, just a draft that we thought was a starting point for the board to consider. And, certainly you can re-script that and find things or add context you feel for the committee's review. Timing wise, then the target was to have a recommendation plan to the board in the spring. We haven't committed to a certain date necessarily, but certainly March, April would be a good plan. Any other questions on the process or the board's role? So just briefly, we've gathered all the data, compiled it, put costs to things. We're well underway in the facility condition assessment as far as that data is. So the next step of that is just to take one more pass with John Barrett and his team on the health and life safety side to make sure that the report that was done last January is fully integrated, as well as look at some of the maybe the more urgent components, might be roofs, HVAC systems, or building controls. Those are 3 things I know that probably deserve a little more discussion. And our next step with John and his team is to put some priorities to those. So that'll help populate all the issues into annual categories, so you can have a 10-year plan that you can map out and look at where do these issues fall in the next 10 plus years. Another item that's more specific, I understand that at Haynes there's some asphalt concerns, so that'd be another probably urgent piece. But that prioritization process, we're set to do that sometime in the next 2 weeks to sit down and kind of populate the data. And that will be the template that the long-range planning, that facility physical conditions subgroup will have at their disposal to understand, here's how this has been mapped out over 10 years, so those questions are answered correctly. So moving more into the educational alignment side of things, this is just a high level look at where your enrollment projections and past enrollment has been and is taking you. Again, there may be some tweaking with the numbers and the orange bar up there as you move forward in the next 2 to 3 years. I know that the district's working on modeling that maybe in a little different form, but this is going to be really close. This is data from as late as last week. The green line that you see up there is what we found to be the student capacity district-wide. And that would be looking at teaching stations within every building based on the use from not just last year, but we've updated it, what the plan was for this year. Obviously, there's been some curveballs thrown into that plan, but what the anticipated plan of use is, so it's as current as possible, because early childhood is moving out of buildings, and we want to make sure that we understood what that impact might have to a capacity as a specific building. Now you see there's a gradual enrollment decline moving through 2023-24. Just the enrollment for the existing enrollment for last year and this year being certainly an anomaly, but to give a sense of what's happened, there was a drop 12,000, just over 12,000 to just above 11,600. And then if you look forward, that the per grade student average decreases from today, which is the first number you see, to the 2023-24 projection. You're starting to lose kids at the elementary level, but not many. It's 786 versus 783 class. Middle school also fairly insignificant, that drop in classroom class size. And then at high school, a little more significant, but it's less than 100, well, it's about 100 kids, a little less than 100 kids. Now, I think the more important piece of the data is looking at the elementary class of 783 projected 3 years out is going to be moving to the middle school the next year, and then so forth going on in the high school. So if the projections are proving accurate, you'll see that trend of continue to be slightly declining pretty much on those model numbers. I would say there's always some variables. Any questions on that information?
Just a real quick, is there a point, and I don't know how far you went in the email, I think this is about where you stopped, but does there appear to be a point where we're looking to level off or bump up slightly with those numbers? Or
there was not from the 3-year outlook. I know everybody wants to have a crystal ball a little further out, and it gets a lot more iffy. I think 5 years out is about as far as people go. The data that we were provided just took us out for the next 3 years. So, building by building, and I'll show you a chart here, it's also in your document. Building by building, you'll see some spikes and some dips based on the planning areas serving those buildings. But from an overall, I think that's the pace you're going to continue to see based on what we know. So this page is tabbed in your report as well. If you want a little more legible version of it, I'll touch on the highlights. We used several metrics to just examine how your schools compared to best practice guidelines. That information is in the book, and that has to do with acres per school site. What would be the norm or a planning guideline today, and where do they stand? Also metrics on square foot per student. How does that compare to planning a few years ago and planning guidelines of today? That metric is also in the book. This is probably the highlight one, just to spend a little more time on, and again, it's enrollment based, but it does show that you'll see there's a few schools that have a rising enrollment predicted versus a subsiding. But generally, elementary schools enrollment looking forward 3 years is stable.
Just a quick one. It's page 18, if people are flipping through, looking for the version that they can read.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So the numbers at the high school, for example, they would not include transitional students. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
My belief is that is correct.
Okay. So what we're missing in this picture is the transitional students and then the early childhood.
Correct.
Okay.
Early childhood, yes.
Thank you.
I did footnote the early childhood, where they're at based on.
The 12th grade does include transition students, that overall, Sorry. Yeah.
Welcome, Dave.
Sorry, the 12th grade numbers do include the transition students. But that, again, I think of that as like 12, 13, 14, 15, there's multiple students there. That's why that 12th grade number looks a little weird sometimes because it goes up. We don't have a lot of mobility, just capturing those kids. It does include those students though.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Dave, for correcting. I understand. So the elementary schools appears to be fairly stable looking forward. The capacity of about 1,557 students at the elementary level is comparing to about 4,720 of your current enrollment. So on paper, certainly there looks like there's space in your elementary schools. Projections at Davis, Lincoln, Munhall could challenge capacity because those are on the upside moving into 23, 24 numbers. They would start to put a little pressure on those buildings. And the one thing that 27 students in the classroom at this point, we also mapped out with 25 students per classroom because I know the board was interested because that fit the buildings. So the side by side, the light orange numbers track those two things to say, okay, if you went to 25, most of these buildings can accommodate the children for that space or that building. The blue numbers, the blue columns, just to kind of give a little qualification of that. That was projections used before the model you're using right now, because we just wanted to see how did this year and last year compare to projections you may have been looking at 4 or 5 years ago, and were they close? Are they in alignment? But the three far right columns are the ones that are showing you moving forward. Now, what this doesn't, if you have a spike in a grade, and we try to track that to some degree, but if there's a spike in a grade or 2 spikes in 2 elementary grades, that's hard to necessarily negotiate because you might have 4 sections in a 3-section building all of a sudden, and your teaching stations aren't there's not as much latitude as just having 27 students in every, because that's mapped out. Those capacities are assuming there's 27 students in every space. We know that can't usually isn't the case. It'd be very difficult to just hit that number. At the middle school, enrollment projections also appear stable. The current capacity of 3,044, and right now the middle school's current enrollment is 2,681. And then high schools, a little bit of decline. Current capacity is 4,986 kids, and the current enrollment is 4,230. I would say that high schools are using their spaces very efficiently. We tracked it, what normally would be an 80-85% efficiency. We found that they're probably closer to 90 and 90 plus. So they're being very creative on how they're using their spaces, and that's helping drive that capacity up, because you take their standard capacity and multiply it by 90%, so it's not dropping much. They're using space efficiently.
So we just wanted to take a minute to kind of, and there's a more detailed walkthrough of what this process looked like to get and gather all this data. For educational alignment, where we began back at the beginning of the year, was sitting down with each of the building principals and walking through a number of topics, including the utilization of the building, how are they using each space, getting hold of what the capacity and enrollments were for the 2019-2020 school year. And then the main focus of our discussion was around in what ways might the facility be creating potential challenges for how you might deliver curriculum. Like where might there be limitations in your facilities that change the way you have to deliver curriculum? What might the priority needs be to be able to deliver curriculum in the way that you would ideally desire? After that, our team went back then and set up diagrams, much like the example that's up on the screen for each of the building, where we just documented what we heard. How was each space being used? This is an example of a high school, and as Dan was mentioning, you'll see there's a little pie chart in each of the typical teaching stations, and that's a representation of how many periods out of the day that classroom is being used for instruction. So it doesn't even take into account Any open wedges is typically like a planning period or something like that. But after dissecting kind of the master schedules that we were given, that was where we came to the fact that they're using these buildings about 90% utilization rate. Is how we decipher that. Once we had these diagrams, we then got together with each of the building's BLT, building leadership teams, to one, get a chance to put this up again and say, did we hear you correctly? Did we misrepresent anything? Clarify a few spaces that maybe we had overlooked. Also confirm the capacity charts that are kind of in the upper right there of that 27 typical student max or cap for a typical teaching station, 13 for a special education program, so on and so forth. Excuse me. But then we went through kind of the highlights that we had heard during our principal discussion and had a deeper dive into what are those priority needs for these buildings. Where do you see challenges? Where might you have some limitations of how you're delivering the curriculum? And then our end result of that was to kind of prioritize the top 5, 7, 10 needs for each building based on that discussion. And that was that group that kind of gave those priorities back to us.
At the elementary level, then, and there's examples in there. This page is actually key to your book as well. But other examples in there for each school. The elementary just has, it's a teaching station, it's a teaching station. Basically, it's a home room, it's a teaching station. Thank you. Those exploratory classrooms are not counted as a teaching station, like in a middle school and high school setting.
And really quickly to add to that, Dan, the theory behind that is that since that teaching station is a homeroom, if the students are at gym, you're not going to necessarily bring a different class into that first grade homeroom. And so that's where that math tends to look at each classroom is then utilize basically 100% of the day.
Next topic, and Allison touched on it, we went through the building leadership teams and talked about what their priorities were. And I just wanted to share what we thought some of the thematic issues or needs were expressed by the different buildings. Now, there's all kinds of nuance to this, and it shows up in the report as well as in the meeting minutes. But these were things that we could say were pretty unanimous in some fashion at each building. But elementary schools, equity, not just from a size of space, but also some of the amenities, some of the older classes or older parts of buildings lack storage or different features in the classroom. Furniture upgrades, that came across in almost every setting, from having a more diverse, collaborative, flexible arrangement in classrooms, and that is consistent at each grade level throughout the district. Collaborative spaces where you could break out, so students could break away and extend that learning environment out beyond the classroom. Support space and storage improvements, and that was kind of hit and miss between different schools. Some expressed a need higher than others. Dedicated special space, not every building has a dedicated music room or an empowered space. There's certainly finding ways to accommodate it, but it wouldn't be unanimous across the elementaries. And then parking and site flow improvements. Again, kind of a mixed bag of needs expressed for outside. Middle school, this space in Thompson, and then the same at Redling, the LRCs, looking at, again, more flexible environments, kind of updated, modernized, collaborative space. And then at Redling, some of the things you see up there were specific to Redling. Again, classroom furniture, some very specific things, improving the restrooms that serve the RISE program, and then couple of site items. At the high schools, not as much common themes, but high school east, sports complex updates, that's more physical updates, not space, increasing space. Culinary arts program, which was slated to have some improvements. Music suite, better using space there. And then outdoor concessions, furniture upgrades, and then classroom equity. East has a series of pretty small classrooms. They're dipping down to the 500 square foot level, and that's a challenge when you have a class of 28 students. I know they're working around that as much as they can, but they still use that as a full teaching station. At North High School, small group collaboration, additional phi-ed space, athletic space, locker room improvements, science lab improvements, getting more flexible space. It wasn't adding space, but what they have with all the fixed peninsula tables, it just doesn't give them the flexibility to run the program that they would like to. Classroom furniture, LRC improvements, and then they have a hallway congestion issue that they came up, and we actually witnessed it, so it's real. It looks like kind of a cattle movement there in class change. And then some parking site improvements. Any questions on, there's, again, more detail on all these items in the report as well as in the minutes. So one of the things we did, and this is simply a conversation starter, moving into the long-range planning process, is how do you solve some of those issues? So we heard the priority needs of each building. This one is specific to Munhall now, and the list is longer, as you can see, than just the generals that we talked about. But how would you add that building? What spaces will get touched to start to address the needs that they express, or the priority needs? So each school in the report has a kind of first blush at how would you solve some of those space challenges. And we know from a long-range planning process that not all these issues are going to be addressed or become the top surface of the top of the list. But from a long-term standpoint, at least it shows that there's a way to handle it. There are some more challenging than others, certainly. Athletic space at the high school, at North High School is a real challenge from a space standpoint. So those are things that would certainly need a deeper look, and that can happen at the long-range planning level. When we're talking about solutions and options, we're revisiting this kind of information and bring it to light. So the items that they prioritize, we will dive into it to this level and say, what if can we solve it this way, and get a little more building specific solutions. So that is really a recap of the educational alignment evaluation that you've got in front of you. Any questions on the process or the deliverable?
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you, or will you, perhaps when you work more with Mr. Baird and facility planning, have you looked at this through a COVID lens?
So a lot of the input we had was just at the beginning of COVID. I don't think people really, when we were meeting with the building leadership teams, we were doing it video conferences, so we had our first flavor of what might the future look like. But we did not, I don't think anybody had it on their radar at that point in time of how long is it going to last until we start talking about it. I think John and his team would be a great sounding board to talk about, because there's things on mechanical systems as far as ultraviolet red, right? There's all kinds of things that are being talked about there. But there's also a lot of things being talked about that are maybe short-lived or unproven. And we want to make sure we're not, and I think from a long-range planning committee standpoint, from that physical condition of the building standpoint, that group should have some focus on how would COVID affect us moving forward. And if there's some infrastructure things we should talk about, we can research that along with John and his team and say, these are things that might stick and these are things that we know aren't worth talking about. So I think that's yet to come. I don't think anything we did specifically dealt with COVID up to this point.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that your timeline to have the recommendations back to the board and that finalization is March or April. I'm concerned about the time frame. I know originally we had spoken about desiring it a little bit earlier, more towards that winter end. If we wait till April, then we may have quite a few new people and players on this, and so it would be the same people you could be speaking to now. So I'm just wondering, is there a way to maybe speed that up?
Yeah, that's a great segue to the next slide, actually. So I just expanded that schedule, looking at, again, this was just a mock-up that we did long ago. We did condense a little bit here in in the last month, and that really was the evolution of COVID and some of the things, the information flow. We're about a month back when we thought we were, when we talked about this December of last year. So, but it didn't really compress the vision and the planning timeline. I think one thing we can look at doing is expediting that. It's really up to the board's discretion. If you would like to push that a little quicker, we can certainly do that. It might mean a little more aggressive meeting schedule, or it could mean that we don't have as many meetings too. And obviously we have the holidays that fall into the seam between the vision and the planning session, but I think it's something we can definitely look at as trying to accelerate that a little bit. This would be consistent with what we would see as a kind of a normal path, but if there's a desire to move it quicker, we'll figure out what that looks like.
I think the amount of meetings that you have on your flow chart as far as the process goes, I think that's a good amount of meetings. I think we can maybe just have a more aggressive schedule. We've got a group of people who are ready to roll, so I think that's what I would like to see.
Sure, okay.
And just to clarify, because it was a little hard to hear you, you would like it done before the board election?
Well, we had originally talked about desiring it for January. When we were originally talking about this, January, February month, so I wanted to kind of stay true to that because we talked about that, and the public heard that that's what they were aiming for. And I know maybe we're setting some of these agreements or whatever you want to call them to kind of set the tone for things. That could be a different group of people who would have been listening to the report, the original report.
I think this board goes to April 20th, if I'm not mistaken. It's 14 days after election law. Or 21 was the new law.
I'll double check.
Okay.
I think it's 14 days after.
Yes, election.
There's a board meeting week after elections.
Okay, so that's probably where it would go to then. So it would be the 13th, April 13th, 2021.
12.
Well,
I'm not counting.
I have a quick question about enrollment. So are we down to 11.6 or is it estimated because we really don't know? It was in this, I was looking at their numbers on page 18. It says unofficial, it's unofficial.
It is, it's the data that was harvested about a week and a half ago.
Right.
To us.
And so, it's a weird year, so.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just wondering if are we really down like 400 kids?
Yeah, we are.
We are,
Part of
okay.
that is the projections have us going down. Part of it
David,
is,
sorry.
People have to hear you.
I apologize. Part of that is the projections going down.
Uh-huh.
Part of it is, we just have to dig into this a little more. Like, I think there's some, like 30 maybe kindergartners that decided not to come, so they're not in the roles that we would have expected. I talked a little bit about, we got some weird ratios we have to try to reconcile.
Yeah, okay.
That's where we're at. I do think what we're seeing flow through, other than some really weird variation the last 2 years, and this being one of them, is where we're going to be. So we have the high schools fading out a little bit. They still have a little bit of the tail end of those larger classes. But we're going to be sitting in this area. And now what we're seeing is we had a nice kind of run of pretty stable counts of kids coming in. Now what we're starting to see is like a little bit larger kindergartner, then a little bit smaller kindergartner. And we're trying to account for some of that. But overall, we are getting to that place where we're leveling out.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding all that correctly. The other thing that I spoke to President Mannheim about, can I bring this up? Is that okay? That like when sorry, I know I should never ask permission first. I'm bringing it up anyhow. When I thought of like facility utilization plan, I thought we would be looking at like the whole picture as function as well. And so I might be mistaken, but I know we analyzed, you did all the schools in analysis, but you didn't put them kind of in the chart. So by leaving pre-K separate, and Haynes, we have some students as well, and we use a little bit of Maids Johnston's for students as well. I thought those would maybe be included in some of our core school facilities. And then in the other facilities, I thought they'd be through the analysis as space. Because in my head, I thought we'd be looking at bigger pictures, like, are we continually doing the right thing in the next 10 years by having a centralized, like, early learning program? Are we doing the right thing for them? And I'm not thinking on any programs, I'm just speaking out loud. Are we doing the right thing for the next 10 years by having a primary and intermediate school set up? And should we do that for all the schools, or should we do that for none of the schools? And so I guess those were the kind of big picture questions I was wondering about. And do we talk about that at the board level, or do we talk about that at the CAC level, or do we not address those? So I guess that's where I'm kind of confused, and I would throw it back to the board if anyone else had thought that, or is it going to be part of this? Does that make sense? Okay. And also kind of the evening out of high schools that we've talked about too.
It's been my experience that you gather all the data and you find out what the community is seeing, and then the board looks at what their vision is after the data's been collected. That at some point those questions are necessary or become part of the discussion. I'm not sure how you would address specific programs at the CAC level. I'm sure Ed has come up with other kinds of things, but those, in my head, those are questions that would naturally arise at the board level after we gather all the data, or during our interim information, like, okay, let's talk about location and and at least that's the way I have experienced it in other districts.
Okay, because this is my first time going through this too, so that's why I was asking some of our board members.
On that note, I kind of anticipated that would come up, but I certainly didn't think it would come up like now.
Yeah.
So I think that probably mostly this is the case said, but I assume that once we figured out utilization and logistics, then we'd say, are these programs, are these situations sustainable as they are, or would they be more efficient in another manner? But I don't know that, I think that's something that occurs after we have, I don't know how many, there were 8, 10 steps. I think we're kind of at the beginning here, so I think probably those things will come up as part of the discussion.
But to clarify, we have the analysis of all those locations in here, right? For whomever starts those conversations.
Yes, and I was going to add to it, each of the buildings are represented there. Haynes is not represented in the document as you see it. It wouldn't be a problem to add at least the footprint of Haynes and what kind of space is, but from a fact-based standpoint, we do have Fox Ridge and we also have Maids Johnstone in there. They're also included in the physical conditions assessment, but I think you're all right on track. That should be a discussion that happens, one, philosophically, but also two, from a space-driven standpoint. Are you getting spikes or crunches where you need to start looking at buildings differently? If that's not the case, then is there a philosophical shift that makes that change more relevant? And I think what we've often done is when you get into these focus groups is bring in guest speakers from the district that can talk about, here's where our vision of the curriculum for early childhood. So that group also has a flavor of, we've been talking about this, don't leave it out of the discussion, because they may not know what's current in those dialogues. And so that would be first charge, is bringing some of those spokespersons into that setting so they get a better picture of what's happening that they can't see. And I think some of this is evolving too. And like I said, if it's not space driven, it's usually philosophically driven. Those are usually the two things that trigger the change.
Okay.
So let's just, if you don't mind, so let's take early childhood just as an example, because right now we have an early childhood center. So if the board, and it wasn't always here, early childhood was part of elementary, but if the board's philosophy is an early childhood center, would you want to know that now or after you've finished your conversations with them?
I think the long-range planning group would perform better if they do that ahead of time.
So that may be what you were talking about.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to wonder, like, what do we need to decide philosophically to set off? And then at what point do we need to talk about some of the other maybe spatial issues or philosophical issues? And then the other question I had is, do we need to, or is there, and I haven't looked through the massive document, apologies, we just got it. But do we need to analyze the space where we have no student but staff and have we? So like the administration building, the Transpo Center, not that we're kicking John out of there, but I don't know, what else would there be?
You brought up Haynes, which is, I think,
Yeah,
something.
Haynes would be
It's a
good.
building we own.
Do we own Shelby? No, we don't own Shelby. So maybe just those three I'm thinking of,
Sure.
like, just to know that what the space is. Not that we would want to go rearranging everyone, but just to know what it contains, what's available there, so we have the breadth of options. What do you think?
You brought up two things that would have been philosophical discussions. One was the early childhood centralization or not. And then the other was obviously the K through 2 through the elementary and the K through 2, 3 through 5 scenario that we have here. One pair of buildings and not elsewhere. So those are two, and those are probably two discussions we should have as we talk about the utilization. Because some of the externalities that might have existed when things were put in place might not exist now.
Would it be a good idea to have, maybe come up with a list of some of those things that we're talking about, some of these philosophical things that maybe we should put on the table for another discussion before they begin the kickoff process, to kind of have a tough out and then make sure that the information gets to that group that, you know, for example, yes, we love primary, intermediate. I'm not saying we do, I'm just saying that could be an example. And so that they would have that information before they begin talking about buildings and building equity and modernization, for example. That's something we should do.
Is there anything else? I mean, I was just kind of spitballing.
Well, I wanted to talk about LEED. I don't even know if LEED is still but what's our carbon footprint going to be? Are we going to be working towards that? Where are we now? How do we make that kind of change? So some of those issues, I was hoping we could at least pose questions. I don't have answers, but.
And I think that we would bring that up, starting at the physical condition subgroup, just talk about solar opportunities, some of the building efficiency items. From a LEED standpoint, it's still a very active goal. It's when you're renovating or doing more cosmetic things or in buildings, it's hard to reach some of those LEED milestones, but certainly the ideas behind it are relevant. And from an energy efficiency, building control is one of the topics that I know John's very interested in talking further about. That is certainly a spot where you can start to create more efficiency through automation and technology. So I think that would usually fall in the camp of the building, the physical conditions subgroup. And those are the kind of questions that we would field for them, research and bring it back and say, this is what we've talked about, or this is where the district stance is. Because these are a lot of time questions. You brought up a few questions of philosophy. Usually that group will ask, has the district been thinking about this, of K2, 3, 5 structure, whatever it might be? They might ask those questions, and then we have to come up with some direction. So at least their thinking is tracking with the board and the district.
One of the things, having been in multiple districts, where you can see what the philosophy was when that building was built. So in the 70s, there were lots of buildings built without windows, open classrooms that with no ceiling or with no walls. So I think it's important that this board considers that we're looking for 10 years out. And we don't want to be so tight with the philosophy, which I would argue is the K2, 3, 5. That's a pretty tight philosophy. We want the flexibility for the community to be able to make changes as the community changes. That's my philosophy. I would rather not get too specific that would hinder future boards or kids or instruction or whatever. And not that we're building new buildings, but I think it's important that we're very cautious that we're just one board in a decade-long process.
Or two, decade or two.
Or two, yeah, or 5.
You're right.
Kind of piggyback on a couple of comments from actually several board members. I do think some of the other facilities are important too, not just from like admin and Haynes. From our standpoint too, we see the constraints with our current board room. And it kind of goes back to Mrs. Fairgrave's comment about a COVID lens. Well, all of a sudden we had a shift and come here because we didn't have the space at admin to do that. I know we talked about almost a year ago, I guess, right? Looking at Haynes as a potential board meeting space, and we pushed it off, because of cost and everything. But kind of circling back, I think things do kind of flush out from a COVID sense. We might not have seen things. Mr. McCabe talked about lead things. We kind of did some things when we automated some of our plumbing fixtures this year. We did it from a health, life safety standpoint, but they do, kind of alter carbon footprint in a way too, and help us with things like that. So I think they all kind of start to tie into each other, and we do see things from different lenses. I know this is the architect nerd to be talking, but I think it's important too to see some of those facility standpoints from an admin level too, because it can help you. We talked about bringing L&T together because they've been spread out throughout the district. So I think not only does it help us as a board, it can help administration to facilitate their goals. And then Haynes is important too because we are having educational programming there as well too. So I think they all do kind of start to tie into each other. There's different layers of it, but I do think they're all very important to know for the future boards, as we all kind of talked about and what that's going to look like, and as we talk about the next 10 years. We're going to lay the groundwork and framework for these future boards and administrations, but I think it's important work we're doing now to make it.
I would suggest, I think what I'm hearing is adding those in from a space availability and how they might fill some voids or add some value to your educational initiatives. We can take a look at that and see, is there space available? Is there a possibility of shifting people from one building to another? And so you have the whole picture. That's not a problem. And I think you're forecasting a question that might come from that facility focused group is, what are we doing with that building that probably should be on the menu as far as a discussion item?
I'm not sure how. I'm not sure about the actual question, but I assume ADA stuff has been discussed. I know we have buildings that are not ADA accessible, if I'm saying it correctly. And is that noted in the reports that we have?
It won't be in that report. So where the ADA portion is living right now is some of the health life safety items have an ADA component to it. Our physical conditions assessment has an ADA component to it. And then we heard from different buildings how they've been handling those level changes and things. So some expressed it as a big challenge, and some expressed it as we get by. So I think that probably pushes the priority. There's ways to accommodate ADA on a temporary basis But from a holistic look at the district, let's get everything up to speed, so we're ADA compliant. That would be something that would be in our physical conditions assessment, talking about where you can't get to as a student or staff.
Yes, I would agree with that. Thank you, Ms. McKay.
One other quick thing, we've talked about the buildings as part of this. Have we considered as well, or are we taking into account the property its own that doesn't have anything on it right now?
We haven't looked at that because I guess if there's a need to, that we need to, putting what's the lens we're looking at the property from is because you need something to be built there, or it doesn't look like you need the property for a long time. I think that will come out of the long range planning process, testing out what would we do with this property if we were to develop it or do something with it.
Well, that's just what I was thinking of when I kind of was jarred into that thought when Mrs. McCabe said, we're talking about 10 years out. Or somebody said, maybe Ms. Wyman, said that we're talking 10 to 20 years out. And so right now we're looking at a decline that looks to be leveling off in 5 years. So that property any property we own might not be of any concern other than to stay there as a piece of property we own. But we still own it. So I guess I'm saying it needs mention, obviously. So that's the only reason it came up. Not that I necessarily think we're going to do anything with it currently.
Sorry. The long range committee, are you finished?
Oh, yeah. Well, this was kind of the standing slide here to just prompt the questions you're asking and think about.
Okay. So the long range committee, you're going to meet with the CAC, but then there's a long range committee. Are you grabbing people from different places? Are you grabbing CAC members who might be interested? Who's going to be on the long range committee? That wasn't clear.
Just the early discussions we had with the district is that the CAC would be the core of that long range planning committee, and we would supplement that with voices that aren't represented there. So educationally, does it make sense to have a couple more teachers involved with that, so they become those subgroups that maybe are focused on learning spaces? So that's nothing's been finalized, but that would be just an early discussion.
Okay, because we have a large CAC. It's at least 25 people right now. So
yeah. That's perfect.
Okay, good.
And high school students.
Pardon?
It includes high school students.
Yeah, that's great. And we recommended that you bring some student perceptions onto this committee. It's a really good manageable target, because when you take that group as a long range group, it's 30 plus people when you add a few folks to it. But also when you break it into subgroups, if you're at 10, 12 people in a subgroup, it's a pretty manageable group. And schedule wise, it's not too ominous to schedule a group of that size in the time frame that we're looking at.
So they would, just to be able to inform them, they're going to be doing a lot of work in October to December, but then it goes into the next year or into January. Okay, so they have a lot of work to look forward to.
Yes.
Okay.
I like the way you framed that.
Is there anything in here that talks about kind of the financial aspect of each building? The cost is to run per student, things like that?
Does not. It doesn't focus on, it's information we could gather. And I think, again, that would be a question you might hear from a long-range planning committee member is, what are we spending on each building or per student? And I think the district probably has a lot of that data that we could collect and offer up to the members.
So I know how much we like to meet. To be quite honest about it, which I'm always honest, I'd really like to read through the material and come back and get a little more focused as to where we are going. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the schools are saying. And I think to Ms. Weigel's point, how can we kind of land on a place that would help guide the work at the CAC level? But I know that time is of the essence if we're going to get done. And I know the administration has a few other things on their plate as well. So I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I think I'm not prepared tonight to land on to argue a point at this point.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm wondering is if you do start with the charge statement draft that has been provided as maybe a jumping off point. I don't know necessarily, other than a couple of items that you mentioned related to specific philosophies relating to programming, that's necessarily going to impact the work of these task force groups. Because really, you're going to ask them to think about broad categories of things with some facilitation. So I wonder if we look through that charge statement and say, yes, these are things we want to know as a board, because then their role is to kind of unpack that at a deeper level and then come back with some reporting to the board. I don't know that you have time in this timeline to unpack it as the board first, and then let them unpack it and then have a report, which is part of what I'm hearing, and that would probably take more time than we have in this timeline. It's certainly something we could do. But I think just looking at what Dan and his team, their experience in walking groups through this process, I think that after the board kind of says, these are the things that we want to know, or we want to hear about, or we want your teams to discuss, we certainly could infuse them with kind of greater detail as the process is going along, but we should get them started, right? And otherwise, it'll be 6 weeks. We'll turn around and it'll be the 1st of November, because it's almost the 1st of October. So I'm just concerned if we wait too long, we won't get the CAC numbers right.
And I agree. I'd rather it get going. I just don't want to, I don't want to come back after, I have been on the CAC side as well as being on the administration side. And I had, as a community member, we spent months and took it to the board who just threw it away. And I don't want that to happen here. So I'm fine looking at this and maybe we can make decisions. I just don't want to waste anybody's time, including ours here at the board table. So getting moving is real important, but I want to be sure that a group of people who work really hard come to us and we don't, well, we didn't want that. That's my experience.
Where in our packet is the charge statement?
It's a very fun.
You buried me in paperwork, okay.
This is for you. This is a cool code.
No, it's in the packet. It's in the supplement.
Oh, this one does. I mean, that's a pretty broad statement. Oh, good.
The early childhood piece is in here. The committee will analyze data in order to understand and quantify building capacity for early childhood, K-12, and associated education programming.
And we did look at the building from a capacity standpoint, that's included in the report. So there, you can tell size of spaces and what it would handle. If it wasn't early childhood, what else might work there? I mean, obviously it was an elementary previously.
Actually, Mrs. Parker even has the comments in there about operational and capital costs as well too. So I think it does, I mean, it is pretty inclusive. I think it does, Ms. McCabe mentioned, does kind of highlight all the things we kind of talked about. So if there's other things we'd like to add to it, I do kind of agree that in essence of time, keeping Dan and his team on task. And I believe, you know, to Mrs. McCabe, there is a lot to unpack and go through it, but I think we can all do that in our individual times and then come back to. And then I just said we can't make it a topic of discussion at board meeting or the services, you know, kind of a checking point as throughout the process as well too. We don't necessarily have to have a special meeting just for this, because we've had updates at citizen services a couple times now, so it might be appropriate to have an update, you know, where we are, kind of where, maybe after a couple meetings, where we are, where we're going. If there's other things that we feel like haven't been discussed or things we want to dig deeper into, I think that's an appropriate course unless anyone has anything else.
I'm good with that if we can keep it, I'm looking at other board members, keep it flowing, because it sounds like I changed my mind, but I think the charge is clear. I would like to add something about the carbon footprint piece and the ADA. I'm not sure, and Mr. Mannheim, you know this better than I do, if that just naturally shows up in what's listed here.
I think so.
Okay.
As the architect, I do. I think it kind of just, those are natural things. I think any building, doesn't matter whether it's education, civic, commercial, the ADA component is so important. It's part of it. It's basically, it's with your codes now. So I mean, you can't overlook it. So I think if there's deficiencies, I think we've seen those throughout our life safety, 10-year life safeties, they've come up, things that have been popped up. So the ROE brings things up. So it's not just, you know, what do we need to do? ROE has specific guidelines that are expected of us as well, being in schools, public education. So I do think those kind of just fall in line with those. I mean, we can certainly add it in there as a bullet point. And then kind of to the lead comment, it is to echo Dan's comments. It's a lot harder to do it on renovations. Not saying we can't touch on some things like, you know, touchless fixtures and solar and things like that. We can certainly do that. It's just a lot harder. LEED, I think, is more geared towards new buildings. You know, it's a lot easier to achieve those goals that's set forth by that institution than it is even doing an addition. So, but there are important things, you know, to be conscious of. So it's not saying we're overlooking them, but I think to Dan's point about, are there solar opportunities for us, or are there other opportunities for us to achieve some of those goals without necessarily going towards an ultimate goal of becoming LEED certified. So is everyone kind of good with that then? More or less?
I mean, there's some things that are mentioned specifically. There are some things that I think are still vague, but I mean, we obviously started to have a discussion here so that, you know, that can be brought to the group's attention as they're kind of going through. This was something that was thrown out, no decision made, but it was a topic that was thrown out.
I mean, I summarized some of the topics. We talked about centralized preschool, yes, no, where, joined elementary across the district or not, or disconnect primary and intermediary, LEAD, COVID lens, ADA. So I mean, you can even start a cheat sheet for your group and say, these are some of the topics we discussed at the board table philosophically. If you want to think about those while you're looking at the charge statement, or if you don't want to interrupt their train of thought, if they're stuck on something, you could throw those out as you facilitate it. So it's going to be up to you and your teams on how you facilitate your groups. But that gives you the basis of kind of what we talked about. And I think some of the things we want them to investigate. I mean, that's the nice thing about having these large groups of people, is you're gonna have a lot of people questioning and investigating and going through all your data, as we will as well. And then when we come back together midway, it'll be good to kind of go through it. So as long as you kind of know where we're at, and I think you do, and whoever will, and Dr. Pearson will be there. Will you be at some of them? Okay, whoever will be there. Our staff will be there as well, so, and they'll help facilitate. So I think I'm comfortable with it.
I would add, if we brought in some spokespersons from a curriculum standpoint, so that focus group had more context to it, are there discussions about, because I don't think you want to charge a long-range planning committee to develop a philosophy that the board might be blindsided by. So I think if you have some intuition of, we've been talking about these things, and give them some framework so they can have a realistic discussion about it. Otherwise, it could be a lot of tangents that start to fall on the plate because they just don't know. And I don't know your whole CAC committee, so I don't know what kind of perspectives they're all bringing. But certainly, if there's some philosophical initiatives that you want on the table, I would try to get those on the front of those meetings before they start to get too deep into their discussions. And I don't know what those are, but if it is an EC or a grade structure or something like that, you might want to have them. They can certainly be a sounding board and talk about it, but I don't think you want them to just freely run in a direction that doesn't consistent with the board. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe we'll be building another school. I'm just kidding.
Don't say that out. Okay, so I think, and Mrs. Barker and I are co-chairs of that, and I think one of the issues that has come up is about equity, and I think I know the history of this community, that all schools should be equitable. It shouldn't matter where I live. My school should be able to have the same kinds of opportunities for my children. But we have not at CAC talked about specific pieces like early childhood, and so I don't know. Dr. Pearson, what's your thinking about the board and these pieces? I'm a little confused. If you're saying you want us to land on something for early childhood, or the K2, 3, 5, or I'm a little confused.
I was suggesting that if there's a direction you're interested in pursuing that gives some guidance to the committee to talk about it, other than, I don't think they're going to come up with anything on their own like that, restructure the central EC. I don't, unless you charge them with that as a topic, which is certainly viable, I don't know if they would just go on that route and talk about something. They might already think, well, the districts did this a couple years ago, they got it solved. Unless you're telling them something different that you want to explore further, I don't know if I would leave it to chance.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's part of the question, so often when you're engaged in this process, you're moving towards some kind of referendum or pretty significant facility improvement process. So that's one of the pieces that is nice about our conversation, is we can focus more on some of these philosophical elements. Not that that's not a part of a referendum, but there's often a driving force. I think if the board has specific desires for the community, for these groups to unpack, should we have an early childhood center, should we not? We use that as an example. Then we need to ask them to do that as a part of, which it's in here, there's a grade configuration category. We need to say, talk about early childhood as part of that conversation. If that's not something you're interested in knowing more about or delegating to them for feedback, So let's say, for example, you've decided you want an early childhood center, then don't have them spend a lot of time talking about that question if the board's already made a decision about it. If it's something you're open to exploring in a different way, then have them unpack that a little bit and include that as part of the recommendation, because they're going to come back with like a couple of options. And so if that's one you want them to talk about, then put it on the table there.
I feel like I've done a ton of talking here. Well, I have a personal feeling about it, but I like the idea of having them unpack it and bring it to us. It is a political issue in this community, and I think it would be good to have the community hear what is good for early childhood and unpack it and let the board then see where the community sees the pros and cons of whatever is best for kids. There are no cons to what's best for kids, just.
But I heard early childhood and then grade level configuration K2 through 5. Are there any other structural issues that you are interested in?
Can I jump in really quickly?
Sure.
So sorry, it's hard to follow along on the computer and on my phone here. I think we need to look bigger picture and task the CAC and any committee for that matter. What do they envision our classrooms looking like 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road? And we have all this data that tells us what our buildings are like, where there are deficiencies. But I think we have to leave it up to the task forces to tell us what they want the educational experience for their kids or the community to be in the future. And then once they give us that guidance, we need to figure out, what the best way to use resources to make that vision come true for the community. So I'm hearing a lot of very specific discussions, but I think for us as a board, we need to look bigger picture and let the administration do a lot of this work, receive feedback from the community, and then again, our job is not to get into the weeds and have these deep discussions. I think we need to look at a much higher level than what I'm hearing right now.
I'm going to jump in on that. I agree but we need to take a look at, as was mentioned before, we need to take a look at the fact that walk into a building that's built in the 70s, you might see no walls, or walls that were put in after the fact because they decided that wasn't the way to go. So I agree with that, but in order to look at that, some of these specifics I do think need to be addressed. I think we need to give that philosophy of, we mentioned early childhood, should it be centralized, should it not be? Those kinds of things. We mentioned the primary, elementary configuration. Is that something that should be looked at for all buildings or no buildings? Those are things that have to be kind of understood before we can look at that big picture and have a direction to go, I think. So I don't disagree, we should be looking at a big picture, but I think there are some components that are the building blocks of this plan that we need to kind of know, so that we aren't 10 years from now saying, I wish we had allowed ourselves the flexibility to pick whatever that issue is.
I also think we need to look at things from, we talked about equity and, adequacy standpoint. And we keep going back to EC, we keep going back to primary, intermediate versus elementary. But we also talked about administrative adequacy. And and the ADA components. So I think that is our job, is to talk about the equity and adequacy piece. And some of these things that have been out there in the community and have been upsetting and frustrating for them in various ways.
I think you see it in here in our learning spaces, building equity and modernization, and then, if you can go down further, how to best serve school districts' educational goals too. So I think, and then, the early childhood piece, I think that if we kind of go through it, I think there are a lot of these things that everyone keeps talking about. I think to Mike's point too, I think, we have all these ideas and kind of things too, but I think there's going to be a lot of other things that we might not even think about as a board that are going to come out of CAC and these subgroups of what the community wants. We hear from some people too, as our roles as board members, but I think we're also going to hear a lot of other things. And so to Mike's point about not getting caught up in weeds, is I do think that, maybe if we do these kind of checkpoints after a couple of meetings and come to business services, or we have it as an item for discussion at a board meeting or something, I think we're just going to start to hear these things and kind of understand what the pulse of the community is and what they want, where they're kind of looking from us from a board standpoint.
So between meeting 5 and 6, then that's where the checkpoint is. I think is what that's on somewhere.
Yes, but I think President Manheim is also alluding to, we could bring Dan back with whomever to speak at our business services more intermittently if we want and need to kind of touch base with us on we could bring you guys in from CAC to let us know what are some of the ideas coming up and what have you. I don't want to speak for Mrs. Fairbury as well, but we're happy to have anyone at CAC give us an update, or at business services, give us an update.
Yeah, I certainly don't think it needs to be between certain meetings. I think, wherever Dan's team and CAC work combined, where they feel an update's important. Like we said, we probably had 2 or 3 updates from a facility standpoint of business services. So now we're still seeing, there's going to be some facility components to it, but there's also going to be programming, and there's going to be other things that might lead us through that. So I think there's nothing that says we have to have it after certain meetings. I think we can, make those as we need, and we have the flexibility in setting agendas each month, so that nothing's set in stone. So if we feel like we need to discuss these things, to Mrs. Barker's point of keeping the train rolling, if you will, so that we can have something in the spring, before elections and stuff, so that the new board has kind of a fresh palette and has all the information in front of them. I think that's important. So
on that note, I just kind of maybe echo the sentiment is what I was about to say. I don't think we have to get to a point where we say, well, this big issue came up, but I can't talk about that till after meeting 5. I think we have to say, if something comes up and you see it as a significant issue, tap one of the committee chairs on the shoulder and say, we have a meeting, this is kind of important, can we have a meeting so that we can keep this? Because the concern I had, sometimes you have to make a choice between doing something fast and doing it well. And we want to do both. And so for us to do that, we can't be waiting for the right meeting to, the right number of meetings to have occurred. And some of that might actually, something that we were going to wait to meeting 5 for might actually have impacted what might have occurred in meeting 2 or 3. So I think it's important that we, as long as we don't have additional meetings, tag them on to other meetings.
This is a document for the future. And I'm not going to repeat what everybody said, because I agree that we want to do this really well, because this is really a legacy that this board is leaving for the future. And we don't have a mandate for a new building or a referendum. This is actually, here's the information that we have gathered to give to the next 5 boards that are coming. And so I think doing it well, being transparent, being open, if we mess up, we mess up. But in the long run, you have a product that comes back that's really a good one for kids who aren't even born yet, whose parents aren't even married yet, you know, whose kids are in high school, who in 10 years, maybe, we may, you know, it's kind of cool to think that this is the future, so, thanks.
And we see it as our obligation to make sure that we're turning over the stones, especially in the learning spaces dialogue, that we're showing things that, here's what other districts are talking about, or how you get a blended learning program, here's how other districts might have been handling that from a space standpoint. So that group will see examples and maybe even time allowing a tour of something that is very interesting to them or shown. The other thing that we haven't shown here, and I don't know how CAC's members, how familiar they are with the buildings. Sometimes it's good to go see a few spaces that we're talking about. Photo or something in a plan doesn't always do it justice. So when you talk about inequity, it's not bad to see, here's a space that's large, well, the amenities it should, teaching the pieces and the parts, and then here's this room that maybe is falling shy of that. It's good to have that comparison, because I think equity is one of the, we've heard it almost at every building, from not just from space to space, but from building to building, is the feeling like there's certain areas of the building that fall shy of what someone else might do. It's hard not to do that comparison, but there is that documentation in the book too that talks about where classrooms are shy of what would be best practice guidelines, and so there's some of that nitty gritty is in there. We've got to lead that group through it too, so they know what we know.
Okay. So Dan, do you feel pretty good then, the direction from the board?
Yeah, I think you've had some great caveats to information we should gather before the group gets together. I'll work with administration as far as setting timelines and what dates work. As far as meeting protocols, you know, we'll have to talk about that too, is in this environment. If these are live sessions in a room like this with 8, 10 people, or do we need to have some Zoom environments too, or some big virtual things? But we'll get the details worked out. But I think you gave us a lot of great insight tonight, so very much appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you to you and Allison for coming out here tonight. That's great information. We'll look forward to digging into it. Myself probably more, but I'll take all the floor plans and CAD if you have them.
Do me the favor of calling me first so we can talk something out if there's some architecturally not accurate.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you again. Thanks. It was great having you guys here tonight. So we do appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's one more.
All right. So that concludes item A for discussion. So then we'll move to item B, which is the duties of school board officers. And Mrs. Barker was gracious enough to put together a little kind of a jumping off point, if you will, just so that we can maybe have some direction tonight. So she listed the current duties and then potential alterations. Not saying we have to do any of them, but at least something for us to talk about tonight, so we can kind of be a little bit more efficient with our time. So I'm not sure if we want to start with the duties, or do we want to talk about, take a moment to talk about, I know there was some discussion from policy about whether it's a 1 year or 2 year, and we kind of talked about a policy.
Okay. So it's just so everybody knows as they're looking at the document where it says current, that's exactly what it says right now. Except for, I did break it into, some of them have permissions on them, and some of them don't, and then some of them have vacancy and some of them don't. If you look on the other side, it says potential alterations. There's what is in italics, and I know it's not super easy to see, but the color printer wasn't working, so I had to use something else. That's what that represents in addition to the current potential addition. And then there's also points of discussion. So it kind of goes through like number 1, for example, it says all meetings, does that include committees, change to the committee of the whole. So it's just like some reasoning behind, okay, why did why did that, I didn't put that in italics. Number one, in the potential alterations, it says committee of the whole, so that's a change, so you know. And then the term there, I did put 2 years, but that's just discussion point. I don't know how you want to go through it, like, point by office by office, or
Yeah, if we want to start there, we can just start at the president and make our way through. So does anyone want to you want to take a minute to look it over? Kind of jump in?
Mrs. Barker, you and I had talked beforehand that 10 minutes before the meeting started, the idea that a president should at least have 1 year of being on the board as a possible alteration.
yes, that isn't in there, but it's something that, because I didn't hear anybody talk about that before, but especially as we're talking about potentially it being a 2-year term, but even at a 1-year term, I think that's something that we may want to consider for the president position.
Just for a point of clarification, we're not taking action on any of this tonight. This is just brainstorming, talking about things, fleshing out things. And then if we are making changes, which I'm sure we will, then we can take that to action at another board meeting, or if we need to discuss it further. I'm sure Mr. Bryant would love to have a policy. So,
If I may jump in as well. Some of this discussion came out organically through the last 2 years of dealing with officer roles in a long contract negotiation and a year of pandemic. And we started looking at how we could tweak this to make it maybe more efficient for all the roles. Part of it is that the role in particular as president over the years has become a more complex role in the different parts of it, and more time consuming. And so President Mannheim and myself have joked often about how we, maybe not often, once, about how we talked to Dr. Pearson respectively when we were presidents about every day, especially in pandemic world. And as much as he might favor our conversation, it's not the ideal situation for busy people. And so some of the changes we thought might be helpful in kind of breaking up some of the functionality. And what Jillian has been above and beyond the role, I think, of what secretary has ever been, due to her efficiency with being organized and detail focused. And it's been incredibly helpful. And I think that's what you see in front of you. So I just wanted to give you kudos with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would it help if I kind of just ran through kind of the additions with the president and just some of the points, maybe reasoning why? And you kind of mentioned some of this was prudent for time and functional, but also some checks and balances too. The president had all of these duties and responsibilities, and then the vice president really just was sitting there waiting for the president not to do anything. And so one of the things that I did put in there, if you look at number 3 on the potential alterations, is that the president makes all board committee appointments, but determines in conjunction or agreement with board officers. So there's some checks and balances, not just one person making all the decision. It's the president is kind of the final appointer, but that there's some collaboration between more than one person. So that's something we can talk about. And then number 4, attend and observe any board meeting or planning meeting at their discretion. It just says board meeting. Again, I know it's a planning meeting was added.
Can I just jump in? You have to be really careful about 3 board members together, so.
Oh, yeah, that would be not just hanging out together, having a convo. That, I mean, that would have to be, you know, separate, obviously
But
separate.
in terms of a planning,
I think that would be if only one person was gonna be there.
that's all it could be.
Right, so then
I have no problem with the language, we just have to be, we have to always keep Oma as the.
right, well, so one of the suggestions, if anyone on this board likes the concept of the officer responsibility split more, is that the chairs, because we have issues with co-chairs, we're treating our co-chairs currently as vice chairs, and that has caused some consternation in the past. And so we either need to clarify that our chairs are co-chairs, or they're chair and vice chairs, or maybe you have 3 officers on the board and then you have 4 chairs and only 1 chair per committee. So that was just a concept that I thought would be good to throw out there. So if you only have 1 person per committee as a chair, then you have an opportunity for a president or vice president to come and sit in on a planning session. The one thing that I found as president, and this is, you know, I'm just going to speak very openly, it was difficult sometimes to find out what was going on said committees, because you do have 2 people per committee, and you know, you have people at a planning, and then you have the committee itself, so you go to that committee, but you're not kind of on the front end of it. And so what's nice about whatever board is here in the future, again, to your point, we're trying to leave a more working solution for legacy for future boards, is that if you have 1 chair per committee, then you have a vice president or president that can come on and kind of see what's in motion, help advise or get information and do some guidance. And they are up to date on everything that's going on in that committee. So if they do need to speak for the whole of the board, they're fully involved and invested in what's going on in that particular committee, conceptually. Again, it's just an idea. People can say they don't like the idea, but I just think from the role I was in for a year, I think it would be prudent to maybe work it that way. So that is an idea I had for committee structure, and that's where it would give the opportunity for a president or vice president to sit in a planning session.
Okay, and then number 5, if you take a look, what was currently there to represent the board and other boards or agencies. And then I put in, unless otherwise delegated to board officers, so it can be delegated. I don't know that the president can be everywhere all of the time. That's not always reasonable. And then, you know, that people do work, and you know, sometimes that doesn't always work out for that role. So I think the delegation plus interest as well was important. And then obviously sign official documents, call special meetings, that all stayed the same. Let me find out if there's, well, the only, number 11, I added in serve as or appoint board officer to the board's official spokesperson to the media and stakeholders. And that can be temporary, as you'll see in the vice president role, or it can be like permanent. For example, that maybe something depending on what area.
And your note says on the back, be specific about where, when, emails, media, citizen comments, etc. So that was a point of clarification that I think should be clear in policy for next year's board. When you're at a meeting, committee of the whole, obviously the president's running that meeting. When you're at a committee meeting, who addresses public? Does board president, does board chair? And so it's not really clear in our policy. So we can either clear it by practice or by policy, but I think it just needs to be answered on what's the protocol on who's addressing those circumstances. As time goes on, I think we're seeing more and more of those circumstances potentially.
And then if you look at the permissions stayed the same with the vacancy. The vacancy is by succession. the vice president then fills the role of the president can't. Let's say the president is unable to or resigns or whatever the case could be. It should be by special election, or should it be automatic? The president just rules up. So that's something to think about.
Just to clarify that, that's just if I resigned.
Yeah, if you quit.
Right.
Resigned.
Sorry. Or,
Because it's not just like if I was sick,
no.
right, then the vice president would run the
Like,
meeting.
Right. You
Right,
can
okay,
stay
just
on
wanna
board
clarify
but resign as president, or you could resign off the board,
Got it.
either way.
Okay, I just want to clarify that.
Like you're not present anymore
And-
as the president.
And we're talking conceptually for future, none of this has to do with this year.
Yeah, nothing would go.
Correct,
Just clarifying.
And then some, in the points of discussion, there's a little plus sign next to things that I'm thinking maybe we should add in. So serve as the board's liaison to the superintendent. That already happens in practice, but it's not spelled out there. And then attend any governmental planning meeting or intergovernmental committee that
It also happens in practice, but we didn't know if it should be spelled out or not.
Yeah, I think those are both good with that, and because it is practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been that way since I've been on the board.
if you look at page 3, you can see that the vice president really just doesn't have anything there, so. Another portion will be there. So the term, I put the term at 2 potentially, we're discussing a 2-year term. And then the 3 that were there previously, there's no change to. But number 4 is just adding that part about reviewing board committee appointments with the president. So just kind of to match that, if that's something we want to change. It's kind of like the president and vice, if we decide to change it on the president's, then it makes sense to change it on the vice president's. And then attend and observe any board committee meeting or planning meeting at their discretion, and then serve as the board's official spokesperson as appointed, either temporarily or a permanent assignment. And this stayed the same, the vacancy, special board election, because the vacancy of vice presidency, and I do think I had that in italics and shouldn't be.
So just to clarify on 5, we might want to put like in accordance with OMA on both of those, just to Mrs. McCabe's point, just to make sure it's clear that there can only be 2 people at those.
And there's actually 2 things. First, I wanted to clarify number 4, reviewing board committee appointments as determined in conjunction. So that is essentially what we're saying in 4 on the previous page, except that on the previous page it included, I think, all board officers. Am I correct?
Yeah, because this is right. So the president is conferring then with the vice president and then with.
Okay, all right, so I wanted to clarify that that's what we were talking about.
So on this one, I just put with the president. The vice president isn't conferring necessarily with the secretary about their thoughts. It's the president's conferring with those positions.
Okay. And then which is one other quick thing with the OMA, because there are typically 2 people that are, board, a chair, co-chair, or co-chairs, or co-chair, however we're going to call it. There are 2, and that Mrs. McCabe mentioned, there's an OMA problem there. How would we determine, hey, you don't get to go to this planning meeting because the vice president or the president wants to go? And so.
Yeah, I don't think it would not. I wouldn't think it would knock that person out. I think, number one, policy only has 1 chair. So that would be one that we would want to do. I also think that we want to think again about whether or not we want to bring our committees, our, L&T, Stacy, and Business Services to having one chair, and then one of the officers assigned to, go to the planning meeting to support. So that's kind of like it's like a co-occurring thought. We have to kind of.
Right, and that's what I'm saying, this would have to presume that
Correct. I think
another thing takes place.
if the board decided they wanted to keep 2 chairs, it'd be irrelevant. Yeah.
It would just end up like.
Right, and that's what I'm saying, that we need to, this is something that needs to be considered as we're looking at other things. Because another thought on that matter might be that they receive a report prior to the meeting so that they can review anything that might be of concern. So that you could maintain the chair, co-chair, or 2 co-chairs, however we were going to do it, maintain that structure and not leave anyone out.
Okay, so we're obviously going to talk about this again. So something I can do is that I can kind of mock up 2 different statements so that depending on what we kind of come up with, that we've got something for the different conditions that might be.
Right, that's why I'm just bringing it up, because I know that this is something we're going to be ultimately talking about later, so that we can maybe refine that and consider, and everybody kind of tucks that in the back of their head, that this is something we're going to need to think about as we make these determinations, because there's a domino effect. One decision is going to affect 1 or 2 others.
One decision is going to affect 1 or 2 others. One decision is going to affect 1 or 2 others.
Do I sound like that?
Yes.
You want to say something?
Mike, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so just my thoughts on this so far. While I understand why it would be important for president or vice president to attend planning meetings of committees, I think by putting that in policy, we're giving the potentially one person the ability to sit in on planning meetings of multiple committees. And if we can only have 2 board members at every planning meeting, I feel like that's quite a bit of power that one person would have to be able to dictate any agendas and so forth. So, this isn't about one chair or co-chairs or whatever, but just putting that into, to be able to say that a president or vice president can go to all planning meetings, it would be concerning to me because of the potential power grab for that. So, just my thoughts.
Yeah, and a lot of what I was doing was attempting to equalize and make it doable too. I think that the issue, the word that may need to be looked at is at their discretion, and we may need to come up with something that works for that fixes the discretion part. So, it isn't well, this is my discretion, and not, just putting that in that perspective. But that's probably the word that needs to be fixed in this statement to make it make sense.
What if we even stripped that down and made it 2 different bullet points? Because actually, when I first read it, planning committee to me, I thought about the other week where I met with administration and Mr. Critta to kind of see the preliminary plan for this for tonight. So to me, that's more, I think of that as the planning committee versus I don't need to be on L&T meeting, I don't need to be a business service. That's why there's chairs and co-chairs, because they run it. I'll hear about it when I'm here at the table. So I think maybe if we even break them down into 2 separate bullet points, maybe to kind of Mike's point, and maybe that's, because to me, planning does, from a president role, we do participate in some of those other meetings to help set these meetings up to be successful. So I participate in that to help make tonight be successful, but I don't need to be in business services, and I need to be in L&T to hear the agenda setting content, so.
Right, so you're setting up with IESB and like, you set those up too, if we have a retreat with an IESB.
Correct,
in
yeah, so
particular.
to me, I think that is more planning versus like committee.
I'm much happier with that than, I think we have to remain to be flexible enough so that a board may want to say, we're only going to have one chair, or we're gonna have two. It depends on the personalities, and it depends on the committee as well. And if we're going to say the board president can show up to committee planning meetings, that sets a precedent that doesn't give any new board flexibility. I like the idea that you're talking about, where there are planning meetings that are the good of the whole board, that only the president or the vice president could attend. But I'm not comfortable with the president or the vice president coming and sitting in on planning committee meetings. And part of it is, we are all elected. We are not really, there is no hierarchy. We're all elected. And how we lead our committees is a reflection on who we are, and our constituents will watch that. So I get the idea that the board president needs to kind of know what is being planned, and I think that's up to the committee chairs to keep the board president informed. But
I like the idea of the report from Mr. McNally. I think that was a good idea. The concept of the 3 officers and 4 board chairs came from actually 203, because they have something similar. So everyone has kind of an equal footing, so they all have a lot of responsibility. You have 3 officers that have their level of responsibility, and then each person is a chair of their own committee, and that's a lot of responsibility. Back to your point of equal footing. So that way there isn't as much hierarchy, and they're not 2 people on one chair. They all have their own independent kind of project that they're responsible for. So that's kind of why I brought that concept up. And if, like to your point, if the board, I guess at the time doesn't like it, they don't have to follow it, but it was just an idea to bring to the table, so.
Yeah, I would, if I would actually advocate for just taking the planning meeting piece out. To me, that's kind of 2 points that have already been made. That's like an integral part of how you're gonna prepare to run your committee, and I don't know that needs to be spelled out. That's my view.
I'm gonna echo that, and especially if we are, like I said, if we have 2 people who are chair, co-chair, or whatever, there's a logistical problem that this probably unnecessarily creates. So I think that's something that I'd like to, I would be probably in favor of removing that. It's now, if we are going to go to a single chair, even still, the idea that the president has their kind of their role, the vice president, the secretary, each have their role, and especially if we're going to be kind of divvying up some of these duties a little bit differently, and then each chair, for 4 committees, each chair that has their role. I think that's. I think from a standpoint of the public viewing this as well, they're getting exposure to each of the board members, because the public wants to know, how do people feel about things? And it's their right to know that. And if we find a way to, not intentionally, but if we find a way where we're hiding somebody essentially from the public because they don't have a very big role, I don't think that's good for transparency either.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna have to rework that number. Some of the things, if you look at the next page, potentially to add, I think this, like all these networking things, work in educational opportunities that further develop the board, as delegated. I don't know if we want to specify, or is that board and agency? I know the educational opportunities might be of interest to add for board development, something to delegate to the vice president.
I'm confused where you are.
I'm trying to find. where
Oh,
you're-
she's
what
on the
page-
back, page 4.
Page 4. Yeah, so the points of discussion for the vice
That's where I
president.
started.
Yeah, if you look at the, where it starts with the plus sign, especially networking, but you'll see educational opportunities that further the development of the board, and then also initiate timeline for board self-evaluation and collect board member reviews for the end of the year.
That was supposed to be
This is the board's self-evaluation.
Oh, the board's.
So just, we're getting pretty specific. And I'd hate to put anything in the policy that would tie the hands of any other board. These are wonderful ideas, but to put it in policy means that's what's gonna have to happen. So I think we have to be really cognizant that not all boards are gonna want that specificity in policy.
Yeah, and I do understand that piece. I think there are some big pieces. There's the support self-evaluation, there's the superintendent's evaluation, and then district goals that they're a responsibility of the board as a whole. And it seems to be falling to the president, but it's no more specified that it's the president that initiates that timeline. So there's been some practices that it's kind of been, oh, we've got to do that, but there's always so much going on. And I'm wondering if those 3 big things get spelled out to at least one of the officers that initiate the timeline and then collaborate with the president, that it would maybe make that more systematic and I'm losing my words, but more, I guess, that it is put together well and planned out in time.
So in researching with other boards, we have the benefit of talking to 7 other boards every week. They do spread out the responsibilities to make them more functional. Because the president, in today's day and age, cannot do all these different functions. It would be a full-time job plus. So they're either vice president or secretary or other officer or whomever, work on some of these things. And so that's why we tried some of this year. Some of it was good. Some of it's kind of trial by error. Like we said, we're learning in a new way of being. We don't have to put it into policy. I would hate for it to be lost for future boards by way of not using it in practice because those people aren't here. So I don't know how we bridge that gap.
If I can, because you just kind of touched on something I was going to ask. You said you didn't necessarily want to, I think I understood you say you didn't necessarily want to put it in the policy. So I guess that's my question is, these other boards where it's in practice, is it written in policy or is it something that just is a practice of the board?
It depends on the district, both.
Because I think that's something that if you have reasonable board members and officers, those are certainly things that can occur, especially when we're talking about, essentially, and I don't remember the wording, but something like president or designee or something there. So that we can certainly do that perhaps without making radical policy changes.
I would suggest, speaking to the last item around the timeline for board self-evaluation and board member reviews or superintendent evaluation, that probably needs to be phrased a little bit differently. I think that falls underneath the president. And the president may choose to delegate or somebody, may raise their hand to assist, but at the end of the day, the president should be determining what's appropriate.
Are you talking about in the secretary's duties?
No.
Vice president.
Vice President, page 4.
Yeah, so the self-evaluation is only in the vice president. But, you can certainly move something like that to the president and then and potential for delegation.
Yeah, I didn't know that was there.
Okay. And then, number 5, we're gonna have to make some changes to the secretary, guys. There's some things in there that just they're not something that.
Can you burn it?
Forgot to turn it up. So there's some changes that need to happen with, I think with this one, with the secretary. There's some things that aren't really being done in practice at all. It's written policy, so then we're not following policy. So one of the things that, and this is not one of those things, but something that came up was when I looked at the qualifications, the secretary is not required to be a board member. I think it should be required to be a board member. There's another position called the recording secretary, which this has filled for us, and that is a different position. It's the next position, let's see. Also taken out is the reasonable compensation, up to $500.
Yeah, I served as secretary for like 5 years, and I know.
Yeah,
I disappointing.
I wonder where that money went now.
We'd rather owe it to you than cheat you out of it.
Okay. All right. So I just think some of that's kind of obsolete, maybe. And then the duties, if you look at the duties, the secretary's duty is to keep minutes for all board meetings and keep verbatim record for all closed board meetings. What I did is I keep all of the board meeting minutes, and it's already in the recording secretary. So that's something that the recording secretary would then do. And then number 2, keep the records of board's official acts, sign them along. There's nothing that changed there. That's just signing different documents. And then,
I think you're good now.
yeah, I think nothing changes till 8. Oh, wait. Number 4, there's nothing changed here, but I have a question about it. Act as the local election official for the district.
Yeah, what does that mean? Do we know?
Must just be doing it.
I don't think so. I think that changed. King County took all of that over.
Okay.
We're not supposed to touch it at all, but we'll have to double check. So any of those changes we need to run through, of course, the law firm, just to make sure
Of course.
we're not missing something.
If I can offer this on that, I think it used to be that you would bring your petitions, for example, to the district office.
Not anymore.
And that doesn't happen anymore. That occurs in King County. So that's probably something that needs to be struck.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can just, before we move on to the next items, you would mention that many of these duties that we have are essentially the duties of the recording secretary. I think they're technically the duties of the secretary, but we have always given them to the recording secretary. And essentially the secretary would be responsible for making sure that if the recording secretary is unable to, then, but we have that situation right now, and we have someone else is acting as recording secretary. So I'm not so worried about those duties unless we want to, and I guess I'm asking, are you suggesting then that we kind of take those out and put those officially in recording secretary?
I think officially, taking minutes for all open board meetings. Obviously, I can take a tape recorder and push the button, and that's all that you do during closed meetings. But I think then we have to say something about it being delegated to the recording secretary.
So, and I guess that's where we could toss in that phrase "or designee." And I don't know if that.
This is that one. And then number 4 is going to get checked on. Number 5, arrange a public inspection of the budget before adoption. So does that need to go to the treasurer? I'm not doing that.
Dr. Chapman, does that need to go to you?
The treasurer does that duty.
But should that responsibility go to your, okay.
Yep.
So, and are we just saying essentially that the secretary goes over to Dr. Chapman and says, hey, we need to have okay, and he says, all right, we're gonna do that.
Well, the other thing I would point out too, if you look at the recording secretary, one of the items in there, it performs the secretary's duties as assigned.
Right.
So a lot of these in effect are delegated.
Or designate.
Right.
I just don't know if they need to be on our secretary function for a board member, if they're staff responsibilities.
Well, I think what they are the responsibility of that person, whoever that is. And we've just always traditionally, it's been our practice, and I think it's the practice of most school boards, to have someone who works for the district to be, essentially the recording secretary.
Right, that's why we're trying to update it.
Well, right now, and I don't know, I guess it's more than anything, it would be just changing the words as opposed to the practice anyway. And ultimately, we have to have somebody be the person who is responsible for that. What would happen if, if we needed to have somebody assigned? Right now, that responsibility, I think, pretty much goes within the kind of the hierarchy of the administration and the office personnel.
Well, under permissions, I'm sorry.
But I'm just saying, ultimately, I think we have to have somebody who is responsible for that, and somebody who's responsible to the public needs to be responsible for that.
Under permissions, it says that the secretary may delegate, so I think we have, I don't mind the cleanup, but we do have those pieces. And
I'm
also
curious-
there's a typo there.
Yeah, there is.
Is that the last sentence you're referring to? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, and yeah, and then to say secretary and president is permitted. I just moved that permitted to participate in all board meetings in a manner equal to other board members. That was only in the president's one before, so put it in the vice president, in the secretary as well.
Mrs. Barker, if I could, Mr. Mark over here. That clause, I think, comes from Robert's Rules of Order, in that sometimes the president isn't permitted to participate, but that in Robert's Rule doesn't extend to other people generally.
It does?
Does not. Only to the presiding officer.
I think I'm missing something. What was the clarification?
The clarification is, so on some boards, like, there's a water commission, board I can think of, and the president does not get to vote. Besides over the meetings, does not get to vote. So that's, I just shoved it on, I just put it underneath there just because, kind of reinforcing that idea, but it doesn't have to be there for sure.
And so what you're saying, Mr. Moore, is we don't have to have that language for vice president and secretary.
Right.
Okay, and then under points of discussion, yeah, so that same question I asked, should be a board member, and compensation, and then number one, we already talked about that, and number two, yeah, I think we talked about all of these already. And so I guess if you go to the little plus sign in the points of discussion on page 6, it's the same thing. It's do we want some of these, one of the big three that I talked about, the board self-evaluation, the superintendent's evaluation, and then the district goals and metrics. Do we want that under the president and that they may delegate those specific things?
I think, personally, this year, I don't think there's anything wrong with putting it under Secretary Dunn in conjunction with the president. The amount of verbiage it takes to write that and time it takes, we had a subcommittee last year. This year we had Mrs. Barker, who was her own subcommittee. I think because of the way in which we do it, it's an extensive process. I don't know that future presidents are going to have the time to do it. I think we are, I appreciate that you want to, give them the flexibility, but I think if you say in conjunction with other officers, it can be in anyone's position, and all three of them.
I don't mind that. If you say in conjunction or in collaboration, I don't think one person should be doing any of the,
I agree, and not one person was doing them all, they were all done in collaboration. But I think the thought was to put the responsibility under the secretary, so I have to keep changing this, because of the amount of editorial time it took, and then done in conjunction with president and or vice president or officers, or however you want to phrase it, because that is the organic process anyhow. And that can all be in writing, but then it's up to them on who really wants to do the editorial process. Someone may want to do the editorial process themselves, but at least it falls to the secretary at the minimum. That's just my thoughts.
So part of, if it is just under the president to be delegated, sometimes people are elected just because it's the political thing to do and not based on the skills that person brings or their time. So you could elect a secretary who has absolutely no time, and a retiree who might. So and I don't know that the two elections we've had have been political rather than really spending time talking about the skills that we all bring to the table. So I think if we're, which is fine, that's the way boards work, but to say this person is going to have that job, then the board should elect somebody who has those skills. And we don't talk about that when we're doing the election. We don't talk about what I bring to the table and what that, maybe you do behind the scenes, but we don't at the table. So
I don't disagree that we need to talk about that more at the election table. We haven't done it by practice. I don't know why. I think we should.
I tried when the very first meeting we had. I tried to have us to talk about it. That didn't work. So I don't know if if we're going to put it in policy, then that's going to be if I see that I'm going to be responsible for writing the superintendent's evaluation, I'm not going to be the secretary. That's really what it's going to come down to. But it may be that somebody wants to be an officer and has other skills, but it doesn't have the time to do it.
I think that does bring an important piece, that if you're volunteering to put yourself out there to be one of the officers, that you should minimally have the time to do what it takes to get some of the work that the board needs to do done, or be willing to put the effort into it, or know that you have the ability or the skill set to do so. And I'm not saying that somebody who isn't super tech savvy can't be, for example, the secretary's position. They can certainly get support for that piece, but they might be, somebody who has time to go through and collect and put the wording together for a draft. So I think that is an important piece, that they're not just positions where, this would, like, for example, the secretary's position is billed as you're just signing stuff. Okay, so I think that's kind of a waste of a position to elect. That's silly. It's important to sign things, but it's also important to maybe that position having some other pieces in place so that people who want to do that position or say, hey, I'm really interested in doing that, like an opportunity to do that, they're agreeing to the actual job itself, not the title.
Right, and that's what I think what we're trying to build and talk about is in the secretary position, that kind of detail-oriented focus is what that position is about. In vice president, and this is all theoretical. Everyone can say we don't like any of this, and that's fine. We go back to the way it is. We're just trying to bring a new lens to it. In vice president role, it's the position of maybe doing more webinars or doing more ISB learning or connecting with learning about what other districts are doing or doing research and trying to bring those pieces to leadership. Presidential leadership and administration leadership and trying to figure out new ideas and stuff like that. That's what I've been doing this year to the delegation of President Mannheim. And then at president level, you're so in it all day long, all wheels of the entire district. And then you're also representing all the time. So with media, with people, I mean, the year before, I was doing all that with the help of all of you, but it was very not spread out. So with the officers, it's more spread out. And then as you have chair people, you can totally encompass that as your own for chair. So if your strength is building, then you're in financials, you're on business services. If your strength is education, you're on L&T. And that, I think, Mrs. McCabe, exactly is what you talked about. What do you do best and what do you bring to the table? So is communication what you do best? Is that what you bring to the table? Then you need to fit in an area that communication shows your strength. And education is your strength. So that is where you show, your best as well. So again, I think that's what we're trying to say. And we're just trying to figure out how do we organically do that and try to set the next board up for that? Or do we not make them figure it out? I mean, that's fine too, but it'd be nice to learn something from all this and try to push it forward.
I think we can have board practices, and I think we can, to a great extent, allow flexibility for future boards. I think with all of these things, especially when we know that things change over time, I think the less you put to restrict how they conduct business in the future, the better you are. That's my own view. If we have, as I say, we can certainly, the president certainly has the right at any time, and others as well, to say, hey, can you help me with this? Can you do this? I need somebody to attend to this detail because right now there's too much going on. I don't want to hamstring a future board with things that might apply to a present, to the present environment. So I think that to the greatest extent that we can leave things flexible for people to operate as they need to, I think that's the best way to go.
I like Mr. McNally, the description that you use, the board practices, or we want to say board best practices. Perhaps we create a document or something that might accompany this or be separate that we can leave for the next board, and they can take those items and decide what might work based on the talent they have at the table and what might not. That would be my thinking.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. McCabe, that's kind of what I guess I'll give a perfect example. When I was first elected to the board, I was the only teacher on the board. Now, look around. I was the only one that had any actual experience as an educator that was on that board at the time. And that's not a bad thing because, but I offered a perspective. Now we're seeing other people that have, so we have an environment now that's different than it was 7 years ago when I was elected for the first time. And so, who's doing what might be different based upon what personnel we have, and how that gets delegated can't necessarily be decided right now by this board for the board that might appear 10 years from now.
And we're elected, so the community decides who's on the board and what talents they bring to the board. I wonder if part of our legacy is what have we learned? And what kind of statement do we say to the future? Because it is about trust. And I don't think any of us have been happy with the way we've done our elections. And I think we might consider, how do we build trust with each other? And how do we use our talents? And if we're really working to be a united board for what's best for kids, we don't know who's going to run. It could be a complete clean out of the 4 seats that are up. And that is going to be a message from the community. So I don't have an answer for this tonight. This is the first time I've seen it, so I'm going all over the board, but I think that it's about how we look at our leadership as the community has elected us to be. And so I like the idea of practices versus policy. So there is flexibility, but I also think it comes down to trusting each other and and I don't think we have all the time. And that may be something for us to consider to talk about for the next board.
On that note, I'd like to also, I like what was said by both Mrs. McCabe and Mrs. Barker, and that is, Mrs. McCabe said we should as a board be looking at the qualifications of the people that we put in those positions, and again, based upon the current makeup of the board, which is going to change. But Mrs. Barker said if you're going to do the job, you should be volunteering to do a job because you know you can do that job well, not because you want that position.
Or because nobody else would do it.
Right. Or yeah, right. You should be, and those are things that I don't know have always been taken into consideration. And I'm not going to say for District 303. I'm going to say on school boards, since I've been paying attention to education, which is, as we know, I've said it 1,000 times, 30 plus years. That's very often, those things aren't paid attention to enough. And it's often to the detriment of, really frankly, of the people we serve, the students.
Okay.
Can I jump in real quick, just because we're creeping up on 3 hours here and everyone's been here for a while. I think that this is all a good conversation we're having, and it'd be my thought that we continue this throughout. We don't have to make a decision tonight on everything. So I think this is great work that Mrs. Barker's put together and that we're all talking about and fleshing out some things, but not to throw Mr. Bryant in front of the licensees. Audio only, but to bring this back to policy, to have it as a further discussion after maybe Mrs. Barker makes some more tweaks. I do like the idea of having best practices, so maybe that's a supplemental document, and we kind of flesh out some more of these things at policy, as our next step. So, because I don't want us to get too far into the weeds tonight since it's almost 8:30.
And Mrs. Barker, I have time to help if you need help in editing.
So I think that's the benefit of us having, we started this discussion of policy and we further discussed it tonight. So we're in September. We have time to make this before, the next board comes on. So I think that's good. I think this is all good groundwork, but I just want to make sure that we kind of stay on task here, and if we can't, get everybody out of here.
When is the next policy?
November.
Yeah, November.
I think it's like
November.
November.
November 16th.
So everyone good with November 16th? Next, take on a draft, coming up with some of those things, planners for on policy, but also on practice, and bring some of these things into practices of the board.
I would suggest though that instead of 30 minutes, we probably need to do an hour for the policy committee. Would be my thought if we're going to add policies plus this.
Yeah, and I don't think we've ever really said policy just as 30 minutes. We just say L&T doesn't start before 5:30. So 'cause we've gone, not last policy, but 2 policies ago, it lasted 45 minutes, 50 minutes, so.
About an hour,
Yeah.
And typically, if we put it before L&T, I'm aware that L&T may not start right when we say it's going to, but it just can't start before.
But it counts to your time. It counts to your time.
So can I just clarify, this includes the two-year term, 1-year term, right?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about it in November. Can we just clarify though, as to this year's, because there's still some confusion on the board about what we're doing with, are we co-chairs or are we vice chairs? I mean, we're co-chairs, but I feel like we function in the board meeting sometimes as vice chairs. So can we just talk about that for a quick second before we adjourn?
I think the structure we've had is, we called it chair, co-chair, and the chair kind of always was, sort of took the lead, but I don't know that there's been really a lot of.
What does it say in policy? Do we know?
It doesn't say anything.
There is no policy.
I guess I don't really know, I'm saying that this is the way we kind of.
Okay, can we bring that up too in November for next year? I mean, we can keep winging it this year, but I really think we need to clarify that for future boards. Or at least put it in a practice for them to clarify themselves.
Well, and if we're just going to discuss the possibility of going to a single chair, then
Right.
that becomes a moot point.
I think it's been a gray area that causes conflict personally.
Well, like I say, I have been both a chair and co-chair, and I guess, at all times, I've always felt like I could voice my opinion, and I certainly hope that as chair, I've never made anybody feel like they couldn't voice their opinion. I try to make sure that, for my part, that everybody has their voice represented, so I'm hoping that's the case. Hope she nods in assent.
I think I got to talk.
All right.
Okay, I think that's it.
Okay, is everyone else good then?
Thank you,
Okay.
Mrs. Barker, for your work.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, with that being said, are there any citizens comments? Well, I could have am. All right, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
You got it, Mrs. 30. Take a roll.
Mrs. McCabe,
Yes.
Mr. McNally,
Yes.
Ms. Weigel,
Yes.
Mrs. Barker.
Yes.
Mr. Bryan,
Yes.
Mrs. Carefree,
Yes.
Mr. Manley.
Yes, we are adjourned at 8:24. Thank you everyone for everyone's hard work and putting time here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you to administration for staying.